So if you remember last time, we talked about disassembling. And so how do you parse a binary into its actual assembly? So sort of human, understandable, low-level code that you can operate on. And we talked about Radair that we will describe in more detail later, and IDA Pro, which is a commercial state-of-the-art tool for that type of operation. Also, the thing you have to understand, there are two main things that we will be involved in. Part is what we call static analysis. Static analysis is an approach in which you analyze the code without actually physically executing the code. So in this case, you take the code representation, you sort of abstract away sometimes what the code does, or you abstract away its structure, and you try to extract interesting information about the code without execution. Classic example are control flow analysis. For example, extracting the control flow graph and understanding which function are called by whom and when, which, if you look at C code, for example, is incredibly easy because you have functions, you have data structure, you understand what's going to happen. But of course, when you are parsing a binary, just recovering the control flow graph can be difficult. Because, for example, you have an indirect call. Jump to the content of a register, and at that point, you have to do a lot of work in order to understand what are the possible targets of that particular jump. So it's not always easy. Sometimes it's even difficult to identify just the beginning and end of functions. And actually there is research in binary analysis that focuses exclusively on identifying how the functions are structured, where they start, where they end, and so forth. Another example of static analysis is data flow analysis, where you try to characterize how data actually flows throughout your application, how variables are used in order to define the data flow in your application, where are they defined, where are they used, and so forth. For this, one thing that we will see is a tool called Anger, which is actually a binary analysis framework that combines a little bit of static and dynamic analysis. It's a lot more than just static analysis, of course. It's something that we developed here, that has been developed in my lab. So we will talk a little more about this, but it's actually being used by a lot of people. There are industry partners that are using this in their research because it has several advantages. For example, it supports a number of architectures, so you can use Anger to, process ARM, process MIPS, x86, of course, and other architecture. Actually, I think Colin here works on developing lifters so that you can extend to other architecture. And I don't know if we do support like Clemency or not, the 9-bit architecture.
We have all the capabilities to support it. We don't support it.
All right. So it is actually supposed to be extensible. So if you find that you have to work on a specific binary for a chip that is a very esoteric, weird architecture, you can always create a lifter, which would be a component that parses that binary and translate it into an intermediate representation, which is what Anger operates on. So by creating this sort of detachment between the actual architecture and the intermediate representation that the tool is working on, you can sort of like operate with different architectures. And Anger supports a number of different analyses, typical data dependence analysis, recovering of the control flow graph in many different ways with different levels of performance hit versus accuracy. One thing that is very well known for is dynamic symbolic execution. And we will see after we will go through all the different attacks and how to break binaries, we will see what dynamic symbolic execution gives us. But I can sort of anticipate you that the ability that Anger provides is that instead of executing a program on real data, you execute a program on sort of like variables that are not defined during execution, but instead during execution, the relationships and the conditions on this variable are kept. And so that at a certain point where you are through the execution, you can ask questions like, oh, I want at this point this variable to be 5. So, 5 functioned before. What should have been the input? And by solving all these constraints with variables, you can say, oh, to get a 5 value here, you should have put a 257 value here. Okay? And this is very useful, especially as we will see in automated exploitation, which is sort of the researchy side of all we discuss here, because as you remember, research focuses on automating this stuff. So we will do all these things manually. You will not have to write automation for exploitation. Not really. Maybe something for the final capture the flag. But fundamentally, you will work manually to understand what are the building blocks that you need in order to build exploit. And then I will tell you a little bit what we do in terms of research and what are the cutting edge directions in automated exploitation. And of course, in addition to static analysis, there is dynamic analysis, which is the opposite dual. Yes?
I've heard there's some compilers that basically try to obfuscate the binary so that you can't figure out what's going on. Would that work? Would this tool work against those?
Excellent question. So the gentleman here is asking, there are compilers that can obfuscate execution. And that's absolutely true. And in fact, static analysis works really bad when there is an adversarial setting. So static analysis can provide very useful insights in a program. And it doesn't matter if it's binary or source code, static analysis is just useful for that because it allows you to navigate the relationship between functions and invocations and so forth. And we will talk about analysis as an automation and a research tool as well. The problem is that with static analysis, it's very easy to make the job incredibly hard. And we can go into the nitty-gritty details, but first of all, you can do the basic. Imagine simply a program that is, sort of like you have m prime, decrypt m load m prime, adder, jump, adder. So this is a simple program that has, some encrypted content before stored in a variable, a function that decrypts that code and puts it in another variable, puts the content in memory by loading it, and jumps to it. Okay? That, with static analysis, is fundamentally impossible to analyze because you have no way to understand, what. If you look at this without executing, the real code, which is m prime, is never exposed to the analysis. And in fact, the vast majority of malware that is trying to resist this type of analysis is packed or obfuscated. So there are compilers like, Obsidian, AS Protect, UPX, that take a binary, pack it fundamentally that way. Sometimes its decryption is just a compression. It's not really an encryption step. But they do so for various reasons. They want to prevent reverse engineering. And interestingly enough, sorry for this small digression, packing is used by both malware and benign software. Because sometimes people develop games or other software and they don't want their software to be easily reverse engineered because of intellectual property. So, and actually, we have here two people that are doing actively research on packed malware to understand how it relates to machine learning and behavior analysis of programs. So, good question. Dynamic analysis works by actually executing the program. in a control environment where you can see what's happening. You have done this a million times because I'm sure that everybody here used a debugger at least once in their undergrad computer science studies. And that's the core of dynamic analysis. You execute something, you go step by step through it, and you see what happens. Okay? So the advantage of dynamic analysis is that you have, if you get to the point where you have a program in the state you want, you know exactly how you got there because you executed the whole thing. So you know what inputs you gave to the program, and you know how to get there. Great, advantage. The problem is that you can reason only about the code that you actually execute. So if there is a whole portion of code that you never touched because it was a function that with your particular input was never reached, you will not be able to identify a vulnerability there. Nonetheless, and we will talk about this when we talk about the analysis step, a lot of research today is exactly on dynamic analysis, for example, through the use of fuzzing. Fuzzing is a process we will see in detail where you give to a program fundamentally a bunch of random data, and you see how the program executes with that input, and then using the trace that you collect during execution, you can make certain either educated choices about how to modify your input to go in other ways, other parts of the program, or you can actually, just go for randomness and hope that somehow you get to an input that will crash the program. This sounds very sort of random, of course, and you might think that this does not lead to good results, but actually fuzzing, especially guided by tracing the execution of a program, has been used in a very effective way by us, by our group, by the world at large in automated exploitation and bug finding. Of course, your friend here is the GNU debugger. In one form or another, you will be using this a lot in homework 3 because you will have to debug all these binary programs, and the only way to know what's going on is to actually get familiar with it. As you know, a debugger can be used to set breakpoints, stop in particular part of the code, step through instruction, inspect memory, and GDB can also be scripted through Python. So you can actually do what we call programmatic debugging, where you interact with the debugger with the program instead of doing manually every time all the steps. Another useful tool for debugging is QEMU. This is something that is a building block for your research. If you work in program analysis, QEMU is your friend. It's a emulator. Fundamentally, it emulates in software the CPU, emulates in software the devices like the disk, the network card, and all that. So it's sort of like VirtualBox. Imagine VirtualBox, but instead of using the switch between real execution and virtualized execution that virtualization approaches use, in this case, it's really like, imagine an interpreter for assembler. You take an instruction, you translate it into an intermediate language, and then you execute it in memory. The advantage of using emulation versus virtualization is that you have a very fine-grained control over what gets executed. So if you think about a virtualization system, it runs natively on the CPU until you have some privileged request, like a system call, or other things that required a privileged access to the underlying operating system. In that case, the hypervisor jumps in and says, you are an operating system that is running as guest into this. You shouldn't be able, for example, to, sniff traffic. Okay? In QEMU, so you have this switch between native execution and switch into execution in the hypervisor. This is great for performance. That's why you can run all these virtual machines and they work almost at native speed, and that's what created the cloud and all that. But of course, you only regain control when you have an actual high-level interrupt. When you request, or actually the program or the operating system that you are executing requests a high privileged operation. In QEMU instead, you have what we call the visibility at the granularity of a debugger. So fundamentally, when you execute QEMU, you can stop at every instruction or every basic block and decide, hey, what's going on here in my system? Not to forget that also QEMU supports cross execution. So you can install QEMU in Linux, and then in QEMU you can load an ARM binary because it supports different architectures. Also very useful. QEMU can have also a debugger in it. So you can actually execute something in an architecture that is not the one of the system that you're using and debug it. So for example, you have a binary, there's ARM in Linux, and so you can sort of load it in QEMU and use a debugger to actually debug that particular binary, even though your machine could not natively execute that binary. Okay, so it's very useful. Also, QEMU has two modes of execution. One that is called user mode, in which you take one process, one program, and you run it in QEMU. But this means that the program can only be sort of a Linux or BSD type of binary. Or you have the full system emulation, in which you run QEMU, and it's fundamentally just a CPU with a bunch of devices. You install an operating system on top of it, and then on top of that operating system, you actually execute a program. All right? Of course, what happens is that when you connect to that instance of QEMU, you have sort of a very low-level view of what's going on. You have a kernel-level view of the operating system, and so it's not always immediately obvious how to access the functionality of the processes that are running within that operating system. Okay, you will not have to probably deal with QEMU, not in this class for sure, but it's an incredibly useful tool for dynamic analysis, and a lot of existing research prototypes are based on QEMU because of the flexibility and the visibility into execution that it provides. An example of something based on QEMU is Kira, which is a timeless debugger. Kira is a composition of QEMU and ImagineGDB so that it provides you with snapshots of the execution of a program. So it's a timeless debugger because you can go forward, but you can also go backwards. Okay? So imagine that each execution of one instruction, imagine this is the memory, the execution of the instruction modifies a value in memory, but also creates sort of another second step where this value is changed. So this is value 1. The execution brought memory from value 1 to value 2. So you have all these snapshots of memory, and you can go back and forwards between them. With a debugger, if you execute an instruction that modify a value from 3 to 5, you cannot say, hey, what was the value 3 steps ago? That value is gone. You can stop and examine, but you cannot go backwards. What Kira gives you is the ability to move, if you want, in time and find all the different steps that are involved in the execution. Of course, this comes with a lot of overhead. Very large programs may use too much memory. It cannot be handled. But for small programs, and especially for things like finding vulnerabilities during capture the flag things, it can be incredibly useful. Okay? And also, it integrates with IDAPRO. So if you have an IDAPRO setup, you can also have the timeless debugger connected that shows you in IDAPRO where you are in the code, providing you one of the best visibility available in the execution of a program. One last tool that is important is Wine. Wine is just a system to execute Windows programs in Linux. So this is another thing that is useful for Windows analysis. It might not work for every Windows program, but it can be really useful if you have to analyze something and you don't want to set up a whole Windows operating system that is virtualized over which you execute your Windows program. Okay, these are the tools that are useful for this type of analysis. Now we're going to talk about actually attacking Unix systems. So we focus on Unix system, not because Windows systems are less interesting. Actually, in some way, they're more interesting. But these are easier to understand, in my opinion. Windows sometimes has a lot of undocumented, difficult to identify features. And in addition, Linux is a free operating system, always available. You can experiment. Windows actually costs money. So we're going to work on this. Many of the concepts that we'll see here have a counterpart in Windows system. And actually, most of the time, you can take any of these attacks and find, format string vulnerability in Windows, and you will have a fantastic tutorial that describes you how to do the same concepts or the same attacks in a Windows system. If I had to do this in class, it would be incredibly boring because we would just go through the nitty-gritty details of the difference between the two approaches. Of course, you can, when you attack a Unix system, you can attack it remotely by connecting to a server and launching an attack to a server. We will see sometimes you can also remotely attack the operating system. Do you remember one attack that we saw in class where you would remote attack the operating system? That's a good guess, but and yes, you're absolutely right. It is an attack against the operating system, but it's not exploiting a bug in the operating system. It's just sort of like exploiting a design flaw of the ARP protocol. Finger attack would be a network service because it's provided by a service. So an example would be the ping of death. So you would attack the reassembly capability, the fragmented reassembly capability of the operating system remotely, and you would crash the operating system. Also, very common nowadays are remote attacks versus browsers. If you think about it, there has been a gigantic shift in the way in which attacks were performed. In the mid-90s to early 2000s, the most important thing was breaking into servers. So you would have port scans to identify services that were open, that you would try to exploit a server, and then you would install into servers some kind of bot, for example, to execute denial of service attacks or things like that. As servers became more and more secure, especially cyber criminals realized that the real money was to be made by compromising, your cell phones, your laptops, because it contains a lot of information that is personal, can be used to open credit cards or to perform bank transactions. And they realized that these laptops and phones and personal desktop don't have a lot of services. They don't have, most of them, they don't have finger. They don't have, maybe they have secure shell, but fundamentally they go out to the internet. They don't expect somebody to connect in. So you can imagine it's something, if you see a network, the network concept was also always to protect outsider from coming in. And now we have these people with browser that are actually going out. And so in the past 10 years, the game has been mostly to create drive-by attacks against browsers. So setting up website with JavaScript that can attack your browser, compromise your browser, and actually break into your platform and install all sorts of stuff. Yes?
Is it true that Chrome uses virtualized instances of the browser to protect against that?
So Chrome's that's okay. The question is if Chrome uses virtualized instances of the browser. Chrome use sandboxing and a different level of compartmentalization to prevent an attack. For example, against one tab in your browser to break out of the sandbox and modify the operating system or influence even other tabs. So there are ways in which browsers defend themselves, and there's been a very long history of attacks against browsers and browsers countermeasures, depending on the type of browser, Chrome versus Explorer. In general, the attacks that were carried out were similar to the attacks that we see here. There were, heap double-free vulnerability versus, file path checking that was not done correctly. A lot of these attacks were based on the confused deputy problem. For example, in Internet Explorer, a common attack was to use the browser extension, the .com objects. I'm forgetting the name of it, but the little components that are executable that can be natively executed within the browser, within Internet Explorer, and that could be used to actually break out of the browser and attack the underlying operating system. So we will not see attack against browsers. These are more of a sort of malware analysis type of application. When we talk about, and then I said that you can do that remotely, and of course you can also do that locally. And locally, you can attack set2id application. We saw that set2id is the process where you can sort of escalate your privilege, or you can have also local attack against the operating system. The vast majority of the attacks that we will see are against application, not against the operating system, mostly because the operating system receives a lot more scrutiny than a bunch of applications. And so statistically, we have had more vulnerability against application than the kernel. And of course, we work mostly on set2id programs, and we influence this program either with inputs, so we can do this at startup by providing certain command line arguments or setting the environment to certain values, or during execution, for example, by modifying files that are used as input by the application. Or we can attack set2id program by looking at the interaction with the environment, the way they access links, the way they access files, or the way in which they interact with other processes. And we will see a bunch of example. And when you're analyzing one of these applications, you really have to understand what are the boundaries of the application, what are the things that can come in, that can go out, what again are the assumption or the trust that a certain application puts in the outside environment. We will see different attack classes. We will see file access attacks. We will see simple path attacks, time of check, time of use, file handler reuse. We will see the classic common injection, and then we will see a whole set of memory corruption vulnerabilities, which are very popular and one of the most frequent way to attack programs. Let's start with the file access attack. So this is very simple, but the way in which you put together a path when you open a file is important. And if a user can percolate user control data into creating that path, can of course break the security of the system. A classic example is the ... attack, also called a directory traversal attack, which is fundamentally using the ... notation of UNIX to go up a directory and convince an application to touch files that shouldn't be touching. And you will be surprised how, for example, especially I must say with web application, this is a very big problem because people are not used to check for this. They just use, the user just sent me his username. Oh, okay. This is going to be, var log app username for the path. So what if you send a username that is ... // temp something? Suddenly you can access something that is not within the initial directory. And you can see here, whoever wrote this is like, I assume that I will only operate under var log whatever my app is. And so the problem here is that the assumption is that you cannot escape this directory, and the way to break in is through this. The lesson learned is that input provided by the user should never be used for creating a path. Sometimes you can use calls like chroot to sort of limit the visibility of an application to a subset, so you're not vulnerable to dot attack, because even if you go, to the root of the file system, with chroot you fundamentally change what is your concept of root of the file system. Of course, this comes at a price, especially in complexity. If you lose libraries, you have to make them available into the file system, and so forth. Other file access-based attack are the path and home attack. Yes?
So if you don't use chroot, if somebody could do the dot attack, if the application is running as an unprivileged user, could they still gain access to different users' files?
Well, it depends. They can access suddenly everything that user can access. So suppose that I have my personal website and I want to give people access to folders with my photos. I wrote my little PHP code that will go only in tilde vigna / photos, and then you can put the name of the subfolder, and suddenly you can read my secure shell keys, because you do .SSH, and I'm serving you my secure shell key, my private GPG key. Maybe you're not becoming root, but you can get all my private files.
But could the operating system protect against that application trying to get into a different user's files?
Yes, of course, because the operating system prevents you from accessing other files if the permission are that you cannot read them. So if you go on Cecil and you try to change the directory of another user, unless that user has the wrong setup, and remember, your home directory should always be chmod 700, which is read, write, execute for you and nothing for anybody else. That is, very simple thing that prevents people from changing in your home directory and getting all your files. It has happened before. I've been teaching classes where students have open home directories, and people will just go around and copy their files for assignment, which is, of course, appalling, but it happens. So there is a path environment, and the path environment, as you will know, tells you in which directories to look for files. If you can influence the path environment for one reason or another, you can determine how a certain binary is found when it is executed with something like execlp and execvp. This function execute external programs, and the P in this form means that they actually look in the path variable to choose the executable. Instead of, of course, if you give a /bin/ls, so you gave a precise, complete path for the application, this is not a problem. But if you try to execute ls without specifying the complete path, the operating system will use the path variable, will go directory through directory, and find the version of ls to execute. So, for example, when I was a grad student, there was a lot of people that had the dot directory at the beginning of their path because they were executing stuff and they didn't want to bother to write something like ./test when they're developing stuff. So they would put the dot, the current directory, at the beginning of their path, so they would just do test and it would execute it. Very user-friendly. They don't have to make any issues. But because of this, one of the pranks that we play in grad school was to have in your own home directory a file executable called ls, and that file would just copy the shell and made it setuid root that the person that invokes the file. So when a friend of yours would go into your home directory and say, oh, let's look what Giovanni is doing, and press ls, because there's the dot at the beginning of the path, will execute your ls. They will copy a shell in your directory that will setuid root them. So you would go back the day after, execute that shell, impersonate them, and do all sorts of pranks, doing cron jobs in their directory, and drive them crazy. So this is a prank, of course, but path actually influences what you're going to execute. Similar to that is the home path directory, which describes what tilde is expanded to. So if you have, for example, say, oh, I want to, in this program, I will reach the home directory of the user. I'm going to do the tilde/something. But if somebody can influence how to set the home directory, so that tilde can be mapped to /etc, for example. Okay? And at that point, you can convince a program to access files that is not intended to be accessed. So again, it's all about assumption. You put a tilde in a path, and you assume that your home environment variable is not being compromised. But if that can be changed, of course, it's a problem. And, so always use absolute paths. / or / something. Those are absolute paths that define exactly what binary you're going to use. If you rely on the environment, the home, path, and other variables that can affect the way in which you look for a file, you open yourself to problems that come from having those variables influenced by an attacker. Another example of an attack are link attacks, where people don't check what kind of file they're actually operating on, and they assume that the file that they're opening is a real file, has certain characteristics, because it's in a certain location. Of course, you can always use symbolic links, to create files in certain locations that actually point at something else. For example, what if you have a file that, an application that assumes that it's going to change something called tilde. They check that the home directory is correct, but they go in your home directory and they use for some .app.rc, okay, a configuration file. But that application is set to ID, and suddenly you make that .apprc a link to etc shadow that you're not supposed to look into because it has encrypted password that you could, build a dictionary attack against. And so by creating a link, maybe you're able to access that information. So especially with temporary file, look always, whenever you see an application creating a temporary file, always look what are the assumptions that this person is making when creating a temporary file. Is this file verified? It is accessed correctly? It is control is checked for the right property. It's not a directory, it's a file. What are the permission, not of the link itself, but of the file to which the link points? And a classic example of this is a very old attack called the DT AppGather attack. This was a set-to-ID program that would just create a sort of a temporary thing for the user called generic-displays-0. So it was a temporary file that would create because it was using the user interface. This is not very important. The only thing that is important is that it would not check, for example, if this temporary file already existed, but would change its permission to be read and write for everybody. It was a temporary file, who cares? So the attack was as simple as creating a link to a file like etc shadow that you want to access, then call the application. The application will go and say, oh, I want to create this file. Oh, the file already exists. Okay. But then if you look at the permission of etc shadow, it was now readable by everybody, where it shouldn't be, an R shouldn't be neither here nor here. Because once you can read etc shadow, you have access to the encrypted passwords of user, and again, you can mount a password guessing attack. So, and this is because this application did a dumb thing. First of all, used a predictable temporary file, error number 1. Error number 2, it went there and say, oh, it already exists. Okay. It didn't check that it was a link to some other resource that was actually security critical. and just say, oh, I want to make sure that it's readable to everybody. So this application, being set to ID root, can actually change this file and make it word readable. And so once again, you have a confused deputy situation in which you convince an application to do something that normally is perfectly okay, but given the right condition, for example, a link to this file, can cause problems. And in this case, the lesson learned is that the type of the file being referenced has to be checked. And has to be checked if it's a link, and if it's a link, it has to be checked that the link is actually, the final file reference to the link by the link is actually the correct type of file. Also remember to use functions that create temporary files in a secure way. So they use a random file name, and even more important, as we will see in a second after the break, that create files and open them at the same time. All right? We will see you in 10 minutes. Let's talk about this interesting class of attack. It's time of check, time of use attack. So the basic idea is that there are 3 moments in this attack. The time when you check a certain property about, for example, a file. The time where you take this property that you just checked and you act on it. And then there is the time of the attack, which is between these 2 times. Okay? So this is time of check, time of use. So time of check to time of use attack is because between the time of check and time of use, there must be a window in which you change the property that has been checked right here. Okay? It's a race condition. It's sort of like, imagine that you decide, oh, the water is warm. I'm going to jump in. And suddenly somebody freezes the water. And you jump and you hit, very cold water. Somebody changed. I know it's not a security problem, but, it's still jumping in cold water. So this can be a problem. And, for example, a lot of code checking tool, we're looking for the access function. Why? Because, for example, in this case, access uses the real UID of the user to understand what a user can and cannot do. Okay? While instead, open uses the effective user ID of the user. If you remember, you have fundamentally 2 user ID. The real user ID is you. So the person that executed a program. And if the program is a normal program, your real user ID or real UID is the same of your effective UID. In the case you have a set UID program, you have your real UID is always you executed a program, but the effective user ID is the owner of the set UID program. So suppose that you're running a program that is set UID root and it is doing this. The fact that it tells you if you can access a file name is based on your identity, but the fact that you can open it or not is based on the effective UID. And so this is root. And so root can open anything, right? So the basic idea, you can see that here there is a moment. There is these 2 instructions are different. So what if I created a link that points to a file that I can open, so I create a link, a file that can open, and I keep executing this program, but I'm always trying to switch the link between a file I can open and a file I cannot open. And I hope that I catch a situation where somebody does access, and I'm pointing to the link, the file that I can open. That I move the link to ATC shadow, for example, that I should not supposed to be able to open, and that's when the instruction happens. So by interleaving this operation the right way, I can have a time of check to time of use vulnerability. And these are very tricky because people look at code like this and say, oh, no problem. In the final you might get piece of C code and say, where's the problem? It's like, of course, everything is fine. You check that you can access it and then you open it. But actually, this is vulnerable code. There are interleaving in the operating system where this specific instruction is actually executed in a different environment than the following one. Is this clear? Okay. No questions? So, the lesson learned here is that you should have some kind of sort of atomic way to perform these checks. And the problem here is that if you look at it, the file is first checked and then opened. The right way to use it is to open the file, so you have a file descriptor that cannot change. You know, once I open a file and I have a file descriptor, you can change the link as much as you want, but I have a file open to that file descriptor. On that immutable, unchangeable identifier or handler, I should actually apply my checking. Okay? And for example, for temp files, I should use something that generate the file and creates a unique file for a temporary file and opens it at the same time. So to avoid, once again, the possibility that you create a file that is a temp file and then you open it, and during the time between these two operations, I'm able to change where the file actually points to. Yes?
So if the file I'm trying to open maybe had some commands that I want to run, if I open the file, can someone else also open the file and edit the contents while I have it open?
Well,
If there's a
yes.
delay between when I open it and run it?
Of course. If somebody can access that file, that can change the content of the file. Depending, this is a more of a UNIX question, but so if I open a file and I read some contents, okay, somebody else can come in, change the contents, and so if I seek back at the beginning of the file and read again, I will get the new contents, of course.
Is there a way to lock the files so that once I...
Yeah, you make that not accessible to other people by changing the permission rights.
Is there a way to do that temporarily though?
Temporarily, meaning that if somebody has access, you can change the permission to that file, use it, and then change it back so others can use it. Yeah. Another interesting operation is the file handler reuse. So you are aware that when you open a file, your standard input is 0, standard output is 1, standard error is 2, and then you open more files and you get 3, 4. These are your file handlers. Well, when you fork, okay, and you fork and then exec a different program, that new process inherits all your open files. Okay, so if you don't do this carefully, and especially if you don't use a flag called close on exec, okay, that is not used by default, the new process has all those files open. So oftentimes there is a pattern in which you have a privileged program that would fork a new program, okay, and then drop, for example, their privilege using a SID so that a new forked program will act as a user. But if those initial files that have been opened by the privileged application are not shut down, the second program, even though has been demoted by calling SID and dropping privilege, will have those files already open and can do read, write of everything. Okay? So this is another very subtle relation between open and fork that is not always well understood. For example, there was in OpenBSD a change password application that will work by sort of like creating a copy of a file, creating a program that would do some operation, but they forgot a handler that was actually referring to the master copy of the password. And so there was an escape to shell that would allow one to start executing commands on the shell, and one can reference directly open file that could modify the original password file, and when they would die, they would merge in the changes. But since the master had been changed using this additional open file, they could add, you know, another root ID 0 account to the system. So make sure that you don't have open descriptors when you create new programs. Another classic attack are common injection, and these are created by the beautiful or horrifying system library call. System gets a string and fundamentally forks a shell passing that string to be executed. Very handy for a number of stuff, or a number of tasks when you're writing a C program and you want to execute something on the shell. Of course, if you're running as a privileged user and you receive input from the outside and you use that input to determine what this string is, you open yourself to all sorts of common injection attacks. And you would think that this is, you know, something that was only on the past. We actually have currently a student that is looking into these vulnerabilities in a bunch of IoT or network devices and found, you know, dozens of 0 days that use fundamentally common injection. So it's something that people use liberally without understanding that if you take user input and you use it as part of a system, you can create all sorts of problems. It's not just system. For example, popen also use the shell to execute commands, and so has the similar problem. So if you have something like this, you know, something, for example, that decides, hey, I want to just, you know, get a command and cat the content of a file in var log. So I don't want to give anybody access to all the var system. I just want to take a parameter, which is a specific file, and it will just cat, so display that particular log file. It seems a completely and utterly well behaved. Of course, here, this command here is completely under the control of the user because it's, you know, created by passing one of the parameters to main, and so sometimes can just, you know, pass as a parameter instead of a file, the name of a file, a semicolon, and then a command. And by putting semicolon, you tell the shell, hey, cat varlog foo, which say file not found, and then execute the following command, and then, for example, you can, you know, see XC shadow or whatever you are interested in. So know that you can actually inject commands in a bunch of ways. You know, semicolon is just one. You can use ampersand. You can use pipe, and all this will allow you to execute additional commands. And this, you know, people laugh about this because they think that it's a lame attack, but it's actually very, very real. And an interesting example is Shell Shock, which came out 2 or 3 years ago, and 3 years ago, it's in 2014. The interesting thing, this was a bug that was in the bash system since 1989. So the bug has been there forever, but it was a common injection attack. Nobody noticed, and I said, wait a second, what if I do this, you know? And the basic idea is that there is a mechanism in which bash can fork other version of bash and can provide, you know, functions in the forked version of bash to be executed. And this is done by setting environment variables with values that start with this. If you put open parentheses, close parentheses, then you can insert in the new forked version of bash these, you know, new functions that will be executed. Great. So fundamentally, the function definition would follow this, the description, and will be executed. So now the problem is how to exploit this. Well, fundamentally, you append comments to the function definition. So you put a fundamentally empty function definition, and then you put a semicolon, and then you put the command that you want. But this has to be in an environment variable. If I'm able to put this in an environment variable, and that is passed when bash is invoked, bash will say, oh, there is a function that they want me to learn. This is the function, but in order to load the function, I just execute the string that is passed afterwards. And as a result, yes, I will learn the function, but it will also execute additional commands. So there were a number of applications you can find on the web, CGI scripts, and others that will receive from the user some kind of content, store the content in an environment variable, and then fork bash. The moment you have this pattern, I get user content, I put an environment variable, and I call bash, somebody could give you something like this to store, and as a result, you would execute commands. And this was, pushed out on the internet in the matter of, few hours. People were exploiting this in the wild. For example, there was restricted secure shell is an environment in which you're allowed only to execute certain commands when you do secure shell to a host. If you put something that is different, that is not one of the allowed commands, for example, I want to allow only ls and df, suppose. If one of the command provided is not the command, whatever was provided was put in this environment variable, and then bash was called. Okay? The result is that you would send as a command this. This would be stored here for logging to know, hey, somebody tried to execute foobar, but you can only execute ls and df, and because of the structure in which it was, you could execute arbitrary commands. So, lesson learned, invoking common with system is really dangerous. So unless you sanitize the content of the command string, you can have all sorts of problems. And things like that happen also in web applications. You receive content from the user and you decide to do an eval. Same concept. Always sanitize input to come from the user. Okay? And it's easier said than done because there are situations we will see in which you might think you have sanitized the input, but there is a corner case that you haven't considered. And actually, part of our research has been in evaluating the sanitization routines put by developers in web-based application. We had a paper in which we got all this code and we say, okay, let's do static analysis to identify the path through an application where that lead for system or similar calls that use path. And let's find paths that are likely to be influenced by user input. So along this chain of execution, is there sanitization? Oh, here it is. Sanitization. Is this sanitization actually doing what it is supposed to do? And so we did analysis with of these cases, and we find many situations in which people just use the wrong sanitization. So never be fooled if you're analyzing an application and you see a path to a system or a popen, and you see some form of sanitization. Don't just say, oh, okay, the input is sanitized. Always wonder, is it? Is it actually sanitized? Because oftentimes it's not. Okay, let's talk about overflows and override. These are sort of the superstar of exploitation. This is where you, in a way, overflow the contents of memory in one way or another and bring the internal structure of an application to an inconsistent state. That when manipulated the right way will allow you to do all sorts of wonderful things. So if you think about it, so far, we have fundamentally either saw confused deputy attacks, almost all the attacks that I show you can be seen as confused deputy. You're trying to do something, you're seeing that you believe that you're doing the right thing, but because your environment suddenly has changed, they changed the files that you were touching, and something else happened, you end up doing something that you shouldn't have done. This is a different type of approach in which you fundamentally exploit the fact that the memory of a program is a composition of state and control, data and control. You have variables, and in the same area, you have stuff that tells you what next code you should be executing. If you think about it, and I know that is kind of a far-fetched analogy, but you remember the Captain Crunch with a whistle that could, make long-distance call by whistling at 2600 hertz? That was the same problem in a way. You have one channel in which you have control, which is the whistle, the certain specific frequencies that would cause certain specific behaviors, and you have also the actual voice channel, and they're mixed together. Oftentimes, when you see control and data on the same channel, there is opportunity for mischief. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, why would they use a whistle instead of just like a tape recorder?
Oh, in fact, the blue box were tape recorders, and they would generate the thing. The whistle was the interesting thing because it would come out in the Captain Crunch actual serial boxes.
Gotcha.
So, going back to this, overflows are architecture and OS version dependent because it depends on how the stack is structured, how the heap is structured, what kind of instructions you're executing. You can exploit them both locally and remotely, and can modify the data internally or can modify the control flow and can have effects of all kind. And there are a bunch of tools that can help you make these attacks automatic. We will see sort of the classic, exploitation of several types of these vulnerabilities. But and we will see tools like Metasploit that fundamentally are point and click. For known vulnerabilities, they have plugins that say, oh, let me break into that particular host. This is the vulnerability I want to use. You click and you break in. You have just demonstrated to be a script kiddie. Somebody who takes a tool that is like, fundamentally a security gun, you point it at something, and if it works, great. What we're trying to understand here is something a little more subtle, understanding the mechanisms of what steps are involved and how you have to be careful about certain things in order to make things happen. Of course, for example, we will see how to put together shellcode, but nowadays, if anybody in a capture the flag or a pen test attack has to put together a shellcode, you don't write your own shellcode from scratch. There are plenty of tools that say, hey, give me a shellcode that will take that file, send it back to me on this specific port, and I want my shellcode not to have any of these characters because there is some sanitization and so forth and so on. So, as we will see, also there is a lot of research and a lot of practice that has been devoted to prevent these memory corruption attacks. And the systems usually have a classic trade-off between usability, overhead, and security. And some of them are now standards in operating system. So for example, in Linux, most binaries are compiled using address layout randomization, so the memory is all in different places, which is a pain when you have to find out where to jump because you don't know, for example, where certain parts of memory are allocated. But again, this is not always true. As we will see, there are some Internet of Things binaries that are 32-bit, completely stack executable, and non-randomized. So this is still interesting. Let's talk about stack overflows. There's a sort of the basic 101 of overflows. We overflow data on the stack. The basic idea is that you have some chunk of data on the stack, a variable, a local variable of a function that is supposed to contain X amount of data. You provide more than X data, and the data overflows. And as we will see, the fact that if you remember the stack grows towards lower memory address is one property that these attacks exploit in order to go up in the exploitation and overwrite the result. So the goal here is to jump to a user defined piece of code that usually called a shell code, and the code can be part of the data they use for the overflow, or can be somewhere else, but of course it will be executed with the privilege of the running programs. So if it's a remote buffer overflow, that means that you will be able to execute code in the remote host. If you're local, if you're doing a buffer overflow against bin ls, it's probably not a good idea because you're going to execute arbitrary code as you. But if you can pass arbitrary code to a set2id file like bin passud, then of course you are executing code as root. So this is the advantage. So if you remember, bottom of memory is at the bottom and top of the memory is at the top. Somebody shakes their head. We had a classic flame war between nerds in which we decide what is the right way to do it. Should the top be on top and 0 be at the bottom, or the opposite? What mindset you have? I want to see a vote here. I know Lucas vote. So how many people will put FFF on top? Let's see.
Quick question. Did
One,
you
two.
read a page in a book from top to bottom or from bottom to top?
Wait. Now you're influencing. Raise your arm. It will not affect your vote. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So the majority, but it's a good split. And so who sees it the other way? Okay, it's almost a half-half split. Well, after this grad student specimen here gave me an incredible hard time for putting the stack this way, I went on a rampage and looked at all the different graphics on the internet. And it is actually a half-half split. But there is a little more people that do exactly like this. You dislike that, Lucas, we know that. But, I think that there is one project that you can do where you crawl the internet and you try to identify how many instances of this there are.
Software. Like most software does 0 on the top. Like GDB does 0 on the top.
I know.
Text editors do 0 on the top.
That's
Every
what I was
program
about
does
to say.
0 on the top.
The whole Google with Go, the whole Google with Go put stack traces in this way. What? Yeah. And they had a big discussion on having stack traces.
This is actually just relating to which way to label it, but he says that if you're reading a book, you start on the first page. You're stacking things on top of each other. You start with the first one, and you stack the next one up. So
Yeah, I see this as a building. These are the foundation, floor 0 and floor FFFFF.
just look at a string on the stack.
Yeah, true. If you look at the string on the stack, it's going to look backwards here, right? But, there are other things that look more natural. For example, if you look at string in the heap, yeah.
Are there compilers that will grow the stack from the bottom to the top?
Absolutely. The stack growing top and bottom is just a convention. You can have all sorts of different uses. You can put the heap in other place, the stack growing upwards, backwards, etc. In Linux system and most Unix system that I know of, the stack grows towards lower thing. And that's why when you start writing up and you start overflowing, sort of overriding control information. Because as you remember, somebody invokes a program, pushes the parameters, then there's a call, the call put the return address, then the prologue of the callee saves the EBP, and then as the buffer. Once you fill this buffer and you go beyond what was allocated, you start, going up the stack, and you can influence these elements that are, control flow elements. If the stack would be growing the other way, and so this was actually rotated like this, if you write down, you would go towards a new part of the stack, and possibly you might reach a point where the part of the stack that is allocated to the stack is over, and you generate a segfault. But you would not be able to overflow the control structures in the stack. You could still, for example, if there is a buffer here and there is another buffer here, you could still influence the data in the second variable, okay? But you will not be able to override the return address and the EVP, the saved EVP. The overflowing function that we, the most common is, getS. Actually, getString is so bad that if you're using a program, the compiler will say, I can't use this. It's going to really complain, give you a warning, and say, you shouldn't be using this, a bad function. More subtle, string copy, of course, is always a problem because they stop copying only when they find the final the terminating 0, so you're never sure exactly how much data you're going to copy. Sprintf, scanf also are vulnerable to this. And of course, any custom input routines. If you have something in the network that read a character and puts in a buffer until it gets a new line, here you are. Possibility for buffer overflow. Yes?
So if I write a program that has an overflow problem, will that overflow problem just affect that one program, or does the operating system not check, this memory is outside your range and you can access different processes?
No, you will never be able to access the memory of different processes.
Okay.
You only break that process. But if that process is running with effective USD root, the code that you will be executing will be code that runs at root. So we will now go through something that it's almost like one of the classic texts of hacking. It's one of the first, or I would say most well-known description of how to run a stack. It's called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It was published on Frack magazine. Frack is sort of like the underground hacking publication. And we will see that it's actually pretty fun. The basic idea is that we want to execute some shellcode. So shellcode is called shellcode because in most cases, or at least in this case, executes a shell. Once you get a shell and you execute this code in the context of a program that has effective UID 0, you will get a root shell. And at that point, you can do whatever you want. In your homework 3, you will have to execute a shell code that will give you access to the next level of your assignment, and you have to go up the stairs to reach as far as you can. In this particular case, you can see it's very simple. It puts in an array the name of the program to be executed, the shell, and terminates the array with a null, and provides the name of the program, which is the first parameter, the list of arguments, your argv, whose first argument is the name of the file itself, and a null pointer environment. That means that this bin shell will be executed with an empty environment. And of course, this will never be executed if everything goes well, because in an exec, you execute a different program. But in case something bad happens, they want to exit cleanly, and so they do an exit 0. We saw how how system calls are executed by putting the right environments and then calling int 80 in Linux 32 bits. This is the system call of the execv. So we will put in EAX the value of the syscall that we want to execute, execve. Then we put the address of the program in EBX, so the string, the shell, an address of the null terminated argv in ECX, and the address of the null terminated pointer to the environment list in EDX. Since we have just null, it's an empty one, and then we call int 80. So in exit is even simpler. EAX is set to 1, the exit code in EBX, and once again, int 80. So we wanted to execute these two system calls. This is our code. The problem is that we don't know exactly where we're going to be in memory. So first of all, we need these strings somewhere in memory. So we need a null terminated string called bin/sh with a 0 at the end, because it has to be null terminated. We need somewhere in memory. Then we need the address of that string somewhere in memory, followed by a 0 pointer, because that should be our argv. Okay? And then we need the address for our environment pointer parameter, but we're going to reuse the last pointer of this. So fundamentally, we need the string itself. I mean, I think I have actually. At a certain point, we have an address. Okay? We will have the string itself, terminated by 0. Then the address of the string and a 0 pointer. This is because this will be passed as the first parameter of execve. Okay? This will be the pointer to argv, which will be the address of this guy plus 0 to terminate the array. And we will reuse this 0 as the null environment pointer. So these are really the few things that we need somewhere in memory at a specific address. Once we have that, we can load those values in EBX, EDX, ECX, call int80 with the right b value, and call the system. So again, we copy the value b in EAX, we copy the address of the string in EBX, we copy the address of the address in ECX, and the address of the null world in the EDX, the environment, and we execute int80. To do the exit, we copy 1 in AX, 0 in EBX, and int80 again. That's how you invoke the system call. The main problem is the string with bin shell is nowhere to be found. Where is going to be in memory? So in order to find out where we are in memory when we execute, okay, we have to do a little trick. And the little trick is to fundamentally execute a call instruction. Okay, this call instruction will save the IP address on the stack. So if we use a jump instruction to a call instruction that jumps back to the instruction, we will know exactly where it's located on the stack, because it will save the current address on the stack. So we can put a call instruction just before the bin shell string, and by saving the return address of that call instruction, we will have on the stack exactly where this is. And everything is much clearer when we see the code. But fundamentally, imagine that we have our things here, okay, and we still don't know what is the address of our string here, because we need the string followed by the address of the string. So we had to put that in. Yes? Oh, I thought you were a question. Okay, so if we jump right here, okay, and here we do a call to here, this call will cause the following address to be put on the stack. It's a call, okay? So here you pop that value and you put in the ESI register, and suddenly you have the address here of the string in that address, okay? So these allow us to do that. Of course, one thing that you notice here is I am on the stack, right? And suddenly I am executing code on the stack. All this assumes that your stack is executable, which is not true nowadays for most systems, exactly because we don't want this kind of attacks to be easy to perform. So this is your executable code. You can see you jump 2A forward, so you jump 42 bytes forward relative, and you jump right here where you jump minus 2F backwards, where you go back here. And now you pop the ESI, and now you know the address of your string here is in ESI. So you can see that now you put a 0 terminators, you put the address that you stored in ESI right after. So you're going to have bin shell, you put a 0, you put the address of the string, that you save in ESI. You put another 0 afterwards, okay? And then you simply build your EAX execve. You put ESI in EBX, the address of the shell that is now null terminated, thank you to this thing. And you put the address of the string, so something that points here. So you have your argv0 and your argv1 is going to be 0. And you put in EDX, once again, just the 0, so you have an empty environment. Then you execute this, and at this point you have the shell. This is probably never executed because it's just the exit routine. If you want to test a shellcode, the cool thing you can, this is the binary implementation of this code. So this code here, if you actually assemble the code, it will give you the actual bytes that are executing these instructions, and these bytes are actually this string up here. Okay? So you can put it in a variable. You can create a variable that is a function pointer. You assign that location to the function pointer, and you call the function pointer, and you can see if you effectively execute a bash program. So this is a simple way to put any code you want here in a C program and see what happens when you execute it. It's a good way to test your shellcode if you need to test something more complicated. Of course, there is a little problem here. And if you think that we have to put this on the stack, and there are many situations in which we will do this through a string copy, because we're copying the buffer and we are overflowing a buffer. The main problem with a string copy is that the moment it finds a 0 value, stops copying. So it will get here and stop. And this is no good. We have to be able to do more than that. So we have to fix the shellcode. So for example, a value that generated a 0 is this move value 0 into this value. Remember, it was the 0 that terminated the string bin shell. Well, can we find something that does the same thing without generating a 0? And for example, something that does this is XOR EAX, which results in 0, EAX set to 0. And then, but you see that here, I don't use 0 as an immediate. So will be not translated in the binary to a 0. I just XOR something with itself, which is effectively zeroing it. Then I move it in there, and then I move, the same value to the other location which I need a 0. In one case, I need just 1 byte. In one case, I need a long because I need a 4-byte pointer that is null. Similarly, when this move EAX, the value of B, which would put in EAX the value of the execv system call. If I don't want the 0 to appear, I use a different version where I only affect the lower part of the address. And this version of the instruction happens not to have the 0 because you're only affecting the part that is actually set by this value. And also, similar, if you want to move something like 1 in EAX, you can, 0 EDX, move EDX in EAX, and increment EAX. At this point, you will have EDX set to 0 and EAX set to 1, even though in this expression, you never use those values, and so you don't have zeros in your shellcode. Net result, you get this beautiful piece of shellcode, and in fact, this /bin/shell in basic shellcodes is all over the place. I'll get to it in a second. And now if you test it, it still works perfectly. But as you can notice, there are no zeros in it. So when you pass it to a secure string copy, it will overflow the buffer. Yes?
Instead of going to all that trouble to replace zeros, can't you just use memcopy? That'll just cause it to set it on.
Of course, you can. Suppose that you have a remote routine that just obtain bytes and just puts them in a buffer until you disconnect. Then you don't have this problem. You can give them zeros, whatever. But if you do string copy, you don't choose the code. The string copy has been written by the guy who wrote the buggy program. So you cannot say, hey, can you make my exploitation a little easier? Can you please use main copy so I don't have to go through this exercise? Unfortunately, you cannot do that. So you have a string copy, and you have to go into the boundaries of this. And sometimes you will have something that waits for a new line and then stops copying. And then you have to make sure that no character here has, value 13, because that would be the new line, and it would stop the copy. Okay? Of course, there are tools that will allow you to build all sorts of shellcode in all different ways. You can have shellcode that instead of executing a shell, just connect back to you, and then drop you in a shell, so you can do remote exploitation. There will be shellcode that execute commands and that send you the results in an email. You can imagine anything. It's just, this is just the most basic shellcode that you can imagine, and gives you a good idea of how it's done.